I know we're running behind schedule from the keynote speakers this morning, but we have just to give you a quick update on the schedule today. I'll be talking in a few moments, we're just running a little bit behind time, on a personal perspective of open source in healthcare. I'll tell you why that's a slight change from the program. And after that we're going to have a panel to further this discussion with, so that although it's on the actual schedule we have open source models in healthcare information systems, that's actually going to be a panel of myself, Dr. Russler, and Dan Hausman, and there's one other I can't remember at the moment, but we're going to be talking about or furthering this exact theme. Then this afternoon, after lunch, we're going to be talking about data processing in BitLi by Jahaya Sezataboto. And then Dr. David Riley will be talking about the Connect system, and Dan Russler will be talking about open source communities in health information technology. So we have quite a full schedule today. But I think we have a quorum here, so let's start with this chat. I was asked to talk about open source and obviously to MC this, but I have to tell you I don't have much. I'm not one of the thought leaders in open source. However, I do have some very particular perspectives that I hope will reveal to you during this particular story, and I think there is some value in that. So I'm going to talk to you about two stories. I mean, it's always good when you're giving a lecture to talk about something you know about, and I can't expound particularly on open source, but I can certainly tell you where open source has influenced very much my career and the projects that I've been involved with. So I'm going to tell you two stories about how this was decisive at very critical points in healthcare projects, and for different reasons. The first story I'll tell you about was the community involvement associated with a vigorous open source project unleashed a disruptive new functionality at Duke in healthcare in a project that I was involved with, an otherwise very conventional project. So that's just an example of how open source forked off a project and completely changed its direction. In the second, the adoption of open source solutions became the central feature of a large statewide project, the project I'm involved with at the moment, as opposed to a completely alternative, which was to buy a series of black box solutions. So open source in this second circumstance has allowed us to focus very much on the human capital associated with our project, domain expertise and creativity, rather than very large black box solutions which would otherwise have been there. So this is how the story starts. I'm an anesthesiologist. Anesthesiologist by training. I happened to get a master's in information systems at Imperial College in London in the late 80s. There was no real market for artificial intelligence and computing in Britain at the time, so I came over to America to work with anesthesia and anesthesia systems. And the state of the art hadn't changed much from this particular picture in the mid-1800s. Harvey Cushing was one of the pioneers of anesthesia, and the contribution he gave actually to not just to anesthesia but to the medical world was that he thought that recording what was happening or occurring during an anesthetic technique was obviously going to be very important for looking at why things went wrong particularly. So the first anesthesia records came from Harvey Cushing, and that actually pioneered medical records in general. But things hadn't changed much over a best part of a century. This is modern anesthesia. On the left-hand side is how anesthesia records are still kept at nearly 90% of American hospitals right now, and many more in the rest of the world. People scribble notes on their legs in the operating room about how things are kept, and this is somewhat of a scandal in anesthesia in modern practice. I came over to Duke in 1992. Because they were one of the few places in the world that actually had some automation, some computerization in the practice of anesthesia, and that was, of course, what I was very interested in. And they had a long pedigree of pioneering information systems in healthcare. And this is one example. They created the Duke automated monitoring equipment in the mid-80s. They put PDP-11 computers on wheels. They used barcoding for their drug submissions. They created a semi-automated record that way. You had to have a line printer in a back office to actually print out the records. And we had a little cluster of about 6 or 7 of these devices up in the old Duke South operating rooms. And this project was was really sort of folding when I arrived at Duke in early 1992. It ran out of steam because the technology didn't actually match what it was supposed to do, which was high acuity, very, very high reliability systems in the operating room. And the technology was not able to do that at the time. And some very strong pioneers were with that, led by Merrill Harmel at Duke. But this is the type of record it created. You can see there's a line printer that's put these dots and notes on a page, and that was the automated record around 1981. So the system survived about a decade. It was overtaken by the PC revolution that occurred in the mid 80s. Reliable desktop computing took this form. This is a PC, but with nicely form-factored into a plasma screen, touchscreen device. Very, very early human GUI interface in the operating room in 1988. I mean, this looks like something out of a Klingon warbird, but it was actually revolutionary in anesthesia. It enabled you at the point of care to be able to touch and interact with the computer, record your drugs in real time as they were occurring in the operating room. It was a display of all vital signs and a tremendously breakthrough device. But the company had a very poor business plan. They had a single angel investor that removed all his money, and the company went broke about 2 years after I arrived there in 1994. But by that time, all anesthesia at Duke was provided using one of these devices, or recorded using one of these devices. They were fully networked. There was network printing, and Duke was a pioneer of this. There were, I think, 44 of these throughout the operating room environment, and I led that project, or came to lead that particular project. But Y2K was a wonderful opportunity to swap it out. Everybody wondered what on earth it was going to do. So money was released, and we were able to make the case that we needed a new generation system, and we bought a system from a company called Draeger called Saturn, which is the one you see in the top right-hand corner there. It was a Windows-based application. You still had to touch it. That was its great benefit over the competition, but it was still relatively limited in what it could do. And what's more, the business case had not been made through the anesthesia community that all hospitals should have these. The vendors were very much struggling with getting these adopted. So still, even though there was a very pretty solution attached to an anesthesia machine like this, there was perhaps only 5 to 10% adoption throughout the US, and that remains the case today with these systems. But still, this took off. Duke acquired more hospitals. We implemented this at many more hospitals, and by the time, it's like in the by about 2000, 2001, we had by far the largest implementation of one of these systems anywhere in the world. There were, at every point of care, at every bed space, I think I have a picture of it, there was a recording system. You could, in the PACU and recovery areas, your record was continuously through from the preoperative holding area through the operating room, through the recovery area. You had a complete picture of of your care, and that was relatively unique in medicine at the time. I'll just go back a little bit. The wonderful thing about the perioperative environment is that it is a microcosm of healthcare. It has all the elements of an electronic medical record. It's got a preoperative piece. It's got a recovery area. It's got the billing process. It's got materials, fantastic materials, and it's a $1 billion a year business at Duke. It's an enormous amount of money flows through the perioperative continuum. And the thing that's unique is it does all of this in a couple of hours whilst you're asleep. So there's an incredibly high acuity element to making it work. It has to be, of course, very reliable, very robust, and it's got to work. So, and it's all done in real time, of course. So, you know, systems look like these. This is these are the monitoring devices and the recording devices in the operating room. And of course, there is the need to continue that through to recovery. The good news about this was by any measure an incredibly successful project. I told you it was by far the largest implementation in the world. I could go and speak about this and did. You know, I was without a doubt, one of the thought leaders in the anesthesia world with these systems. It had grown up with my expertise over the course of well over a decade. You know, it was marvelous. But the users were not totally happy with this. When you wanted to print a record, when you wanted to view somebody's record, you had to go to one of these workstations, log in, and you could view a record. The only way you could see it was by cycling through the point of care record. You know, you had to scroll back at a minute resolution to see what happened, you know, in the first part of the record. There was no way of, and if you printed it out, it was a 30-page record to print out. It was very unfriendly in those terms. It was optimized purely for patient care, but not in any way for you to actually see what really happened in the case. A bit like going back to a Walmart checkout to see, you know, what happened in the first case, the first person going back through Walmart's that day. It was optimized for one purpose only, which was to input data. So I was, you know, actually quite dissatisfied with the system that had been brought to my end users. So this is this disruptive piece I was telling you about with open source here. I was a bit of a tinkerer and realized quite early on that you know, I had full access to the database. I was the champion of this particular system. I knew every table and every field in the database underlying this distributed system. So one day connected a Tomcat server to it, write some JSP code, was able to actually view the same data that was being used in the clinical system. And you know, obviously I'd hijacked the codes and the passwords that the vendor used for its access to the database. But I was able to actually express the same data that was otherwise in the point of care system in a web page. And the result of that was we were able to actually, you know, with a bit of coding, show an anesthesia record in HTML on the web as a complete parallel to what was actually done through their point of care system. So now instead of a 30-page record, we could collapse that down to a rather pretty looking one-page record using a medium HTML which was entirely designed for viewing and making things pretty. And it was a completely alternative way of looking at anesthesia records. It was the very first time this had been done. So what we were able to put together was now actually a shell on top of our entire perioperative process where anesthesiologists could actually look at medical records using this technology as a completely alternative to the point of care. Not only that, they were released from going to those workstations and using them in order to look at records. So now you could look up the anesthesia record of your patient from home. How did they do last time, which is the single most important question an anesthesiologist wants to know. What drugs did they get? What problems did they have? So that was, it was very revolutionary for anesthesia for us to be able to do this.